This is the stillness of the eternal beginning, the world,
as it has always been. Welcome to the Indiana Jones universe, the podcast that explores the incredible adventures of the world's greatest globe-trotting archaeologist, Indiana Jones. Each episode is a casual and somewhat humorous, opinionated conversation with a slightly sophisticated analytical study of the expanded universe content from the Indiana Jones franchise. You can expect to find discussions about the adventures of young Indiana Jones, the further adventures of Indiana Jones comic books, the Staff of Kings and Emperor's Tomb video games, the Indiana Jones novels, the original soundtracks, and so much more. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Indiana Jones Universe podcast. Thanks so much for joining us, and today we are continuing our exclusive interview series to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which includes behind-the-scenes conversations with some of the talented filmmakers, directors, and writers who contributed to this phenomenal television series. For part 3, our very special guest today is one of many talented writers who worked on Young Indy and brought George Lucas's ideas to the screen. He was responsible for writing 3 terrific episodes, British East Africa 1909, Princeton 1916, and Vienna 1908, and also contributed to 3 of the TV movies, Travels with Father, Attack of the Hawkmen, and Hollywood Follies. So, with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our very special guest today, Mr. Matthew Jacobs.
Good morning. Hi, Henry. Or Henri, I should say. and Elijah. Nice to meet you. The thing you've got on your thing, the shot of young Indy coming down into the tomb.
Oh, of course.
That was done, shot on a little stage. That was where I went to meet Billy August. And I saw that being shot, that moment. It's quintessential Young Indy.
It is.
I think that vision was totally in George's head. He knew exactly how to shoot it. All he had to build was the doorway.
It's really cool. It's just like got that backlight and everything.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
All right, so let's get started. To begin, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did your film career begin, and how did that ultimately lead to your role on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles?
My father was an actor, and so I was brought up in the business as an actor. I was in the National Youth Theatre. I then went and worked with Ridley Scott at RSA as a runner in the editing room. I went from there to university and studied drama and was taught about directing and more acting. And then I went to film school, and at that time in the 70s, there were very few film schools, but a big supporter of film schools was George Lucas, and so already I was interested in him. And it was around the time I was graduating from film school in 1980 that the original Indiana Jones was out and about, and I was working for Paramount. And he was just a hero of mine completely.
Wow.
And when I graduated from film school, I graduated as a writer and as a director. So writing had sort of come to me while I was at film school. And then it wasn't that. Then for about 10 years, I was in the industry making TV shows, making mystery shows, doing TV films. And I was in the middle of doing my first feature film as a director, a film called Hallelujah Anyhow, which ended up playing Sundance in 92 and played, in London in 90. I'd been over to the States a couple of times with a few projects like Paper House and things like that, and I was just starting to have an American agent at ICM. And I was in the middle of shooting I get a call from my agent, Sue Rogers, saying, "Oh, they've asked to meet you for this Young Indy, this educational series that George Lucas is doing." And so I was pretty bowled over. They won't write directors, because George's original intent was for the writers to direct the shows, his very first intent. And it was and that was why half of us were really directors as well. So Hales was a sort of dramaturge at the Royal Court Theatre and was also a very good director. Obviously, Frank Darabont had just started directing. Hensley wanted to direct. I was already directing. But we were also, and he kind of wanted half the team to be British, because a lot of it was sort of set in Europe and around the place, and the other half to be Americans. Anyway, I got this call at lunchtime, and I went back onto the set for this film, Hallelujah Anyhow, going, "I'm going to be making an Indiana Jones thing." And I thought, this is really strange. And my DP was a wonderful guy. And he was, "Oh, well, we better shoot an action sequence then." Yes, let's do that. Come on. And then, obviously, I had to go for an interview. It wasn't like an offer. I had to go and meet George. And Rick, obviously, knew my work, because Rick had been involved with British television. So I went to meet him at the St. James Club, and I can't tell you what it was like sharing a tiny, tiny elevator with George Lucas and Rick. And I was sort of squished in there. I was about as nervous as a man could be. And then when we started talking, I talked about how I really, really loved American Graffiti, and how I felt that American Graffiti, when I was at drama school, we'd been inspired by American Graffiti to do a sort of Mods and Rockers version of Midsummer Night's Dream, and I thought American Graffiti was a little like Midsummer Night's Dream, and he was fascinated by that, and so we kind of hit it off. And then, so it wasn't very long after that I heard back that, "Yeah, Matthew, they want you to come over," and we went over and started work on the show. And very quickly they decided they had to hire star directors, and so it seemed like that was almost like an enticement, which very quickly ABC were going, "No, we need, if we can get Nick Rogue, if we can get, the leading directors for each country to do these shows, we'll do that." And I was perfectly happy with that, because, it was amazing. It was such an amazing experience making this show, because you got to work with, not only did you get to work with George, but you got to work with brilliant directors. And George was very inclusive of, most shows, writers can be marginalized, especially in the early 90s and late 80s. But George would, fly us all over the place to sort of sit down with the director for the final draft. So we were included all the way, basically.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention Ridley Scott, because Simon Windsor actually mentioned him as well. I think he worked with him for a little while. But sounds like to me like your initial conversations with George Lucas and Rick McCallum went really well. But how well did your own creative vision align with their ideas?
Well, when you're hired to work for somebody like George Lucas, your creative vision becomes, it's part of your job to align your creative vision to the producer's vision.
Right.
So you don't get into a fight, and to be quite honest, you wouldn't want to get into. I think I had one disagreement with George, and his way of dealing with the disagreement was to just go, "Oh, that's interesting," and you wouldn't hear anything, and then you would be fired. But I wasn't fired. But it would be. He doesn't. He's not a sort of combative person, I don't think, in my experience. He doesn't need to be. I mean, when somebody's that strong of a producer and filmmaker. They have an innate confidence. So it's a joy to share somebody's vision there, and this really was his vision. His vision for Young Indy, as I understood it, was history was being badly taught in America. In high schools, people didn't really have a deep understanding of the early 20th century. And the early 20th century, the time span that's covered in Young Indiana Jones Chronicles is such a foundation for everything that we're still experiencing today. And right from the beginning, he was saying, well, the aim is to do, a network show that'll have a big audience. And Indy is this great way of introducing people to these different subjects. And then I'm going to do, another 90 or so documentaries to accompany them. And right from the beginning, his real objective was the DVD release, so as an educational tool. So I think that was always his creative vision, and I signed on to that wholeheartedly. And I just love history, and he was very aware of the fact that every one of the writers on board, had their passionate things that they were passionate about, and so it would always be a case of we'd break the stories together over a couple of weeks. At Skywalker Ranch, and living in the writer's block, as it were, and he built these great places for us to stay in, and we'd meet every day, and we would spend 2 days on each story for the season. Nobody knew who was going to write what. Then at the end of that, at the end of going through the season of maybe 15 shows or something, whatever it was, they'd say, okay, choose one that you definitely want to write, and choose another one that you think you'd be great at, or you think that you think. So you basically would say, well, I said I wanted to write Vienna, and I was, and I think I was keen on one of the other ones, and they ended up giving me Vienna and the African one, I think on the first round of writing. So yes, the vision aligned, basically.
Right, and talk a little bit more about that entire screenwriting process, because it was very different from, say, a traditional television series and, other movies as well. What was your, collaboration like with the other writers, George Lucas, the research team? How did that entire process go?
So you would be flown over. You didn't really know what the stories were going to be. You'd arrive at the ranch. He basically then you'd be given this giant book that Debbie Fine had put together, because Debbie Fine was the head of research at Lucasfilm, and she'd done wonderful research work throughout her career, and she was, it's fantastic stuff. And so she'd put together this giant sort of Bible that would have a digest of each subject. If it was Picasso, if it was Kazantzakis, or if it was you suddenly had this giant book to read, and but obviously you'd read it as you went into each episode, and basically George had a very rough idea of what he wanted to get out of each story, and he kind of pitched that to us. This is how I remember it. Maybe one of the other writers might remember it differently, but he kind of pitched that to us, and then he'd get out a piece of paper and he'd basically write from numbers 1 through to 20. He said, "Well, this is how I want it to begin," and so we'd know that. We'd know that on the initial show, we were doing 1 hour TV shows, and they were all 1 hour TV shows. It was a later thing to shove them together into features. So for example, the Hollywood Follies my show was a completely separate hour about Indy and and Jack Ford, and Jonathan Hales had written a completely separate show about Indy and von Stroheim.
Dang.
And so they were different shows. And then later on, we came back when we realized we were going to have to combine some of them into features. We came back and did a separate pass where we combined them. We worked out things like Attack of the Hawkmen was the most complex. And then when they tried to do it, that's why you end up with Ben Burt taking writing credit as well. But in terms of process, basically, he'd sit down and he'd say, "Okay, this is an hour, and I'm going to 20 beats, and we know that there are like 3 commercial breaks or whatever, and we'd start in roughly mapping out what was going to happen. Normally, we always knew that the first quarter, if you like, of the story was going to be setting up whatever it was that was drawing Indy, be him the older Young Indy or the younger Young Indy, into the situation and the story, and that would go right up to the sort of midpoint where whatever crisis or whatever twist was that took you into the third act, not the third act, the third quarter of it, would happen. The third quarter would always be the bit where we'd go deep into whatever the subject was. So, for example, in Vienna, where he's with Freud, Jung, and Adler, the whole of that third quarter is one scene, is the scene, where Indy is basically trying to find out the meaning of love and gets 4 definitions, gets, the Freudian one, which is, it's all about sex, and gets Jung, it's all about archetypes, gets Adler, it's all about, the structures within society, and gets his dad, where it's a sort of medieval vision of romance, and it arms him for what would be the fourth act, which is always Indiana Jones going off on an adventure, in that case breaking into the palace, finding Sophie and being able to talk to her, and getting that locket, which we'd already decided, we already knew before we did that the locket would be the thing that saves his life.
Wow.
Yeah, so we already knew these things. The whole thing, the thing about George Lucas is he is an incredible architect. He can envision whole worlds, and he embraces that universal vision in a very, very exciting way. And I learnt a lot from that. And sometimes it would, I would get into a terrible mess because of it, because I'd come away and then I'd be commissioned to write, something for DreamWorks or something, and it would be, and they'd say, "Oh, well, just write the short treatment. We just want treatment." And I'd go away and in sort of Lucas-like fashion, I'd write almost like a 20-page piece that was about an entire universe that was enough for 15 movies. And that people would then say, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Well, this is what I was taught to do. You've got to create a universe." And he had that in his mind, I think, when he was starting Young Indy. And a lot of it, I think, comes from his sheer excitement in imagining what could happen, not only in the future, but in the past. So it's almost like, if you can think of it, if you can imagine that maybe, the Nazis wanted to get a telephone line to God, then you say, let's go and look at the research. Oh, yes, they did try to find the Ark of the Covenant. They did try to do that. And so it wasn't like blanket research. It was like, from what he'd read in history, he would be inspired by something. So he looks at he says, well, look at all this stuff that happened oh, look, 1908, you have the first psychoanalytical conference, and they're really interested. Well, if we have Indy staying with the, American ambassador, there's no reason why he can't meet them. And then what should happen? Oh, he should fall in love. Who would be the most dangerous person for him to fall? Princess Sophie, and the story. So he really had that story in his mind. I think in many ways that was one of his favorite episodes.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't because of my work or anybody's in particular's work. I mean, I think he was very happy with the work, but he always wanted to do it rather like a Bergman film. So we had Max von Sydow playing. I think we had Billy August directing, who basically is the inheritor in some ways of Ingmar Bergman, and the cast on that film was to die for. Basically, it was just this beautiful cast. And I went over to London and met with Billy August at the final stages, and we really refined the script quite carefully. But at the end of the day, it's a TV family show, and they're difficult to do. Family shows on TV are very difficult to do, and in television, it's much more of a writer's medium. So every time there was a cut, sometimes we'd watch dailies, because we'd be at the ranch, and he had viewing theatres there, and also, the whole process was such fun. I have such fond memories of it. I really do. And he would involve us in the process. I do remember, like, there's one episode which I didn't write, but certainly was involved in the story. All the writers were involved in every story, basically, because so we'd be in a room, and there would be 7 writers, and we would be all spitballing ideas, including George, back and forth, arguing, eating too much, having a laugh, and telling working out how to tell these stories, coming up with ideas that we just couldn't do. Everything would be taped. In fact, it was my job most of the time to organize the cassettes.
Wow.
And so at the end, you'd end up with like 6 or 7 full cassettes of trying to put together the story, and over 2 days. And then on the final day, George would go through his notes, and he would just basically say the story that we'd got, and that would be the story. And you didn't know who was going to write it until you got to the end of the 3 weeks or the 2 weeks, or however long the story session was, where we were building it. Then you'd do your first draft, right? Then we'd all be flown out to the ranch again, or he'd come to London, which he did once, and then we all sit down and we read. We've all read each other's drafts, and then all the writers would give their notes. This is when it was like, this is where you discover whether or not you like the process, because you get everybody's notes, but at the end of the day, it's George and Rick's notes that were the most important.
And what do you think are the most fundamental elements of any good screenplay, and how did you try to adapt that method for Young Indy?
Well, I think most writers, if they're honest, don't really start with a kind of manifesto in their head of how to write. They'll adopt different manifestos as it goes along. They'll choose stuff that works. I approach each project slightly differently. Around the time I was hired to do Young Indy, everybody was talking about hero's journey and things like that, which certainly, George was a great proponent. He'd kind of, set the ball rolling with all of that. My personal thing is that I'm interested in 3-dimensional characters, and when I talk about a 3-dimensional character, I mean your first dimension is very much what drives you consciously as a person. I mean, this is how I interpret three dimensions. What drives you? I want to be rich. Or I want to fall in love. I want to find out what this is. I want what consciously is driving you in life. And then the second dimension is very much everything that characterizes the characteristics that express that first dimension. So somebody who wants to be rich, like they'll mix with the right people, they'll go to the right school, they'll socially climb, all of those characteristics, the way they look after themselves, everything, and their backstory. For me, that's the second dimension. Now, most writers stop there. They say that's character, your backstory, your what drives you. But the third dimension, which is, I think, the most important dimension and actually makes the story in most stories, is what are you doing wrong? What is your problem? What is your flaw? What do you really need to do as opposed to what you want to do?
That's so interesting.
And so that when the audience starts to get an inkling of that, normally somewhere around the beginning of the second act, they go, oh God, yeah, if only he could see that he needs to do this or she needs to do that. And then the story becomes about whether or not they're going to learn that. And then normally by the end of the story, they do kind of learn it, but then they have to learn something else from their interaction with the other characters that gives you that surprise and that thrill in the third act. So, I mean, I can articulate this so much better than I could when I was working on Young Indy. Well, because so many years have passed since then, and since then I taught screenwriting, at lots of universities and things. So I've continued writing and I've continued making movies, but I've become very interested in teaching. And George was a tremendous support for me when I made that transition, and I started teaching at University of Texas at Austin and things like that. And he wrote letters of encouragement so that I could get those jobs.
Wow.
So it was, so if you like the process of, or how I thought story, how those basic tenets of what makes a story great. For me, what makes a story great is, what is the character arc? How does the character change or not change? If the character succeeds in changing, normally that's a happy ending. If the character doesn't, then it's kind of a tragedy. And they're both perfectly valid. Normally the happy ending is the more commercial, but the sad endings are just as important and just as commercial in their own way. And I think George was very aware of the hero's journey, and he would, so the business of people learning stuff as they progress through their story, which is very much part of the hero's journey. The whole of Young Indiana Jones was sort of built on that. It was built on Indy would really learn something.
Yeah, it's a really great inspirational show. It's like Tintin.
Yes, and Tintin is quite close in spirit to Young Indy.
It is. It really is.
Because Tintin was always, getting involved in something, and as a child, those comic books, the graphic novels, really. Tintin goes to the moon, Tintin does this, Tintin does that. And as you did it, it woke you up to, oh, this is space travel. Oh, this is this piece of history, or this piece of that. And then you go and look it up. And that was the aim behind, Young Indy. The aim behind Young Indy was that, people would watch a show about, Kazantzakis, and who nobody knows who that guy is. But then after watching the show, maybe they'd go and read The Last Temptation of Christ, or find out about philosophy, without being preachy, it had very similar objectives, I think, to Tintin. It's one of the shows that I am most proud of having been involved with, and certainly most proud of having worked with all those great other writers and the directors. I have very fond memories of it.
I love the way you're talking about three-dimensional characters. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And as a writer, do you ever put like a little bit of yourself into the characters?
I think you have to. Just because I come from an acting background, and because I still act and do stuff, inevitably when you act, you have to bring emotional memories of your own to characters' memories. So you can actually be believable, so that you can both hit the marks and look real at the same time. You can say the lines and they sound like yours. So in order to do that as an actor, you have to adopt. You have to bring a part of yourself to it, so you can recognize that part. And even if you're playing an alien, or if you're playing a lamppost, or you're playing a dog, whatever you're playing, you bring a bit of yourself to the table. And I think the same applies to writing. I think everybody has their own fingerprint. And a good way of, if you want to find out what your fingerprint is, there's a good little game that I play with writers and filmmakers and something. I say, okay, before you ever thought you were going to be a filmmaker, before you ever thought you were going to be a writer or an actor or whatever, when you were a child, what were the very first two movies or TV shows that you remember loving? And you'll find that no one comes back with the same two. Everybody comes back with a different two. It's very, very rare that you find somebody who has the same two. And then look at the questions that came out of those shows. Just think about those. And normally it's the very first thing that your parents made you love, or you wanted to love for your parents. And then the second one is something that's more about you. Or in my case, Walt Disney's Jungle Book, and then 2001. So what's the similarity between those two things? They're both about very dysfunctional relationships and father figures, and things like that. Do you see what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
In answer to your question, yes.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, that's a really great answer, and a very interesting philosophy to think about that. And also, I would assume you use that as well, when you're teaching as well, which is really fascinating.
Oh yeah, it's the first class. The first class, no matter what I'm teaching, is what's your fingerprint. And it's entertaining because it's a way of students getting to know each other, because we'll run the trailer for whatever they've talked about. We'll run 2 trailers and then we'll discuss that. Do you see what I mean? And normally in a trailer is very clear about what's driving each thing. And it can be very touching for people, because they suddenly go, the connection between those 2 things. Of course, I didn't realize that. And then they realize, and then I say, well, there you go. There's your third dimension.
But let's start talking about some of these episodes in order here. The first one you worked on was British East Africa 1909, which is now also known as the first part of Passion for Life. What do you think is important about like the theme of friendship in your filmmaking, and how did you try to communicate that, through the relationship between Indy and Meadow?
I think what was important under that, and I think the thing that George was going for as well, is that as a child, it's easier to make friends with people than it is when you're an adult. So the sort of wisdom of innocence, if you like, and I think that's comes. I think that's the best part of it, is the build of his relationship. Which was, them basically trying to overcome their linguistic differences, and him learning about the ecological, consequences. Basically, learning some very modern lessons about ecology and about, it got nominated for oh my gosh, the Environmental Media Award.
Really?
And we lost to an LA Law episode, but it was, for me, it was George couldn't go to the award ceremony, so I was sent with my wife to go to it, and we sat at the Paramount table. And it's the first time I'd ever really been at an American awards ceremony. Everybody sits around, being very polite. We were with the people from Frasier and God knows what. And then as soon as they've realized that you're not going to win, they're gone. And there's a terrible moment when you think, we might win. And it's being presented by, Michael Keaton and all of that. And it was, so in the middle of all of that, I was, it's like somehow the message gets lost, but it doesn't really, because we haven't really learnt. We're about to destroy our planet. Nothing much has happened since the 90s in terms of making things better, in terms of action, and I think that's really what, mankind kind of messes things up.
Yeah, there's a scene where Roosevelt says that mankind has the power to destroy the wilderness, and that must never be allowed to happen. And I saw that today, and I was just thinking about how it is being allowed to happen, and it's continuing to happen, and we're just seeing it get worse, which is terrible. We haven't really learned the lesson.
Exactly. His philosophy was more like, we should make a park.
Right. He didn't understand the big picture.
He didn't really get the big picture. And in some ways, Indiana Jones's philosophy was, it just belongs in a museum. Isn't right on either.
Yeah. I think you really successfully convey Indy's talent for language skills. So what about this language barrier did you feel was important to articulate to the audience? And, did you ever work with a translator to learn these languages?
No, when you write something in another language, you normally write it in your language, and then you have a little parenthesis that comes under or beside the character's name, where it says in German or in thing like that. And then you write it in English, and then obviously later on, when it's in production, you will have a German actor, you will have a translator. They'll rewrite it they'll say that they'll do it in German or whatever, and then it'll have the subtitles, which will be the dialogue that you wrote. And so that's really, I didn't have to become a linguist, but obviously you do learn. You're just as I was talking about before, it's that second dimension of the character. You know what I mean? What's driving Meadow? What's driving Indy? Why are they talking to each other? They need a friend. They need to get away from the adults. Do you know what I mean? Want to go and have some fun. And the things that people say to each other are always because they want to communicate something, or enthusiasm, which I think in that particular case was the idea of two boys who are the same age and being able to share similar things. They come from such different backgrounds, but they're both excited about seeing this deer or this gazelle or this. They're both excited about that, and then of course you have the characters come out, like we see Indy being afraid of a snake.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about this show that I think is very, very interesting, and a great example of the attention to detail that you and all of the other writers had is, even though this was such an educational show, there's so many great moments where we have callbacks to the films, or we see these characteristics develop. You know, for example, when he's afraid of snakes that first time before the events in Last Crusade, or a small scene that I think was actually cut from the DVD version where Indy's father meets his friend Medlicott, and they have the Genius of the Restoration college greeting, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, was paying tribute to some of those iconic characteristics from the films really important to you in this series?
I think it was important to all of us. I think if you suddenly get hired to write something where the previous movies had been like, you know, these big hits, you sit down to write it and you think, oh, what am I going to put on the stereo as I'm writing? Oh, I know. Dun, 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 dun. And so, oh, I should get this right. You're suddenly enjoying being within a franchise that you've always loved. I had the same experience with Doctor Who, with Lassie, you know, with other kind of franchise things that I ended up doing.
And, you know, another great aspect of this episode, too, is, you know, you talked about this a little bit earlier, is, you know, we learn so much about Roosevelt and his genuine interest in ecological preservation. And, you know, I like these, you know, relationships and moments with these historical figures, because I think it shows us as an audience that even someone as famous as Teddy Roosevelt is capable of learning his own lesson at the end.
Yes.
Right? So how did you approach, you know, all of these sort of relationships with historical figures, and then this fictitious character and adventurer like Indy himself?
I'm not sure there was a specific method of approach. I think, obviously, you try and work out by what your relationship is by doing as much research as you can. I mean, a lot of it is the method, I suppose, is research. Is basically this is where Debbie Fine was wonderful, you know, and this is where we'd have lots of discussions, you know, with the other writers as well. You know, it's like Jonathan Hales is a very wise man, and so he could say, well, of course, you know, sort of, you know, Lawrence of T.E. Lawrence was really into young boys. We shouldn't do this, maybe, George. You know, and it was and then it was like, no, let's just ignore that. So there would be all sorts of things where there's stuff in history that maybe wasn't, you know, family viewing ABC, because history, you know, the reality is always more interesting. I think that, you know, one of the episodes that I adore, Carrie Fisher wrote, I think, was where Indy loses his virginity to Mata Hari. And of course, Nick Rogue is directing that. And Nick Rogue is not the sort of director who would normally do a you know, an ABC family viewing show. So I do remember Nick Rogue coming to the ranch during one of the writing things, and having dinner with us and with George, and George sort of trying to get around the fact that the way Nick had shot the film was very sexual, was not, and they were having to work out all these ways of making it so that it could get through standards and practices. So a lot of that comes from, you know, like Nick Rogue's perspective of Mata Hari was so it wasn't just the writers, you know, it was the directors, and the casting, and all, you know, every aspect of production goes to make a film. It's, you know, that's one of the joys of writing for film. It's really, you know, you're a small part of a community. It's not like writing a novel where you just got an editor. You know, everybody's bringing stuff to the table, and that's why, of course, a lot of films don't work, because, you know, organizing so many people and keeping the thing good is difficult. That's why directors are so important.
Absolutely. And let's move on to the next episode you wrote, which was Princeton, 1916, now known as, of course, the first part of Spring Break Adventure. And the idea of Indy solving a classic mystery kind of feels like, this old Hardy Boys adventure, which are fantastic books I read growing up. And it's so fun to see in the context of Indiana Jones. So, for this episode in particular, and especially with this whole show, every genre of each episode is so different. And so does that make it more difficult or easy to have to be sort of changing between these different styles?
Well, it was an interesting episode because in some ways it reflected on George himself. You have two characters, Edward Stratemeyer, who was running a group of writers who were busy writing, adventures, and there's that wonderful moment where Indy talks about Tutankhamun and things like that, and then as he's leaving, Edward Stratemeyer goes open the door to the room full of writers. Boys, I've had a great idea.
I love that part. Yeah.
And that was that. So it's sort of ownership of ideas, the way in which capitalism will often promote one person, like Edison. Edison similarly, I've had a great idea, and he steals somebody's idea, So it's there's all that business of appropriation by means of basically, capitalism. I own you. I own what you think. That for me was one of the most interesting aspects of Princeton. I mean, there was the sort of wholesome kind of. Joe Johnston caught it really well. He's really good director, and he caught it really well. That sort of wholesome kind of Americana. What's the name of that great illustrator was almost a Nazi, I think. God, those wonderful photographic, sorry, it's just gone from my mind. It will come. Please cut that out. It will come in a moment. Anyway, who does pictures of, a cop at an ice cream stall with a kid on the hand. Do you know what I mean? And it's just that sort of, dogs chasing fire engines.
Yeah.
The idea was, here is Indy before he goes off on any of his adventures. He's basically an innocent, but he's still very, very, very kind of sort of in awe of I think to a degree because of his experiences as a younger Indy, and he's still very sort of, there's a wisdom he has which attracts. The girlfriend in that story. But I do remember that the bookends were with George Hall were tremendous fun. With the big wheel truck, the two of them, and it was about cars, and George is in love with cars, and obviously if you look at graffiti and you look at Star Wars and you look at any of these things, you can see his love of cars, and so that was very much there. Also, again, another ecological thing, which was that yes, Edison had developed an electric car, and this was the truth, and this was the thing where Debbie Fine was so great. It was like Edison had developed the electric car. We could have had electric cars right from the get-go.
Yeah,
but the gas companies didn't make sure that didn't happen. That's part of the story. So Indy's thinking that the sabotage is all Germans, and submarines and things like that. But it's not. It's the gas company.
Yeah, and you talk about the like Stratemeyer Syndicate, which was such a different way of writing back then. With everybody else getting doing all this hard work, and then, Edward Stratemeyer getting the credit and using fake names for all of his novels,
Yes.
And another part of this episode, too, which is interesting, is Indy sort of at the beginning is very invested in this novel, Tom Swift and His Electric Runabout. Why did you decide to include that dialogue from the novel and use it as sort of this voiceover? You even show the book, too, which is very interesting.
The books had just come into the public domain, so I think we could do that. And certainly that was a sort of Stratemeyer kind of book, and they come from that exact era. And the early Tom Swift books were kind of like a young Indiana Jones of their era.
They are, yeah.
And at that time, actually, I was being hired to write. I got commissioned to write a feature film. Never got made, but it was a deal. I got commissioned to write a Tom Swift movie.
No way!
And
wow.
Yes, way, as you would say in the 90s. But it was very. So Tom Swift was a kind of a big thing, and it also captured the idea of the sort of 50-cent novel. Because people didn't have TV to watch then, so they were reading those novels. They were paying 50 cents for them, and they were as hooked into those as people are hooked into Indiana Jones. And of course, the whole approach George has is sort of a reverence for popular entertainment. That's where Star Wars comes from, and that's where Indiana Jones comes from. They're basically taking the Saturday morning cinema, taking the serial adventure, and turning it into something that we can watch now.
Exactly, and it has such a different feel to it. With Indiana Jones, he's working on homework, he's going to prom, but, as a young boy in that time period, I think it successfully does that, right? I mean, he has this girlfriend named Nancy who, we talk about it with Stratemeyer. Yeah, I was just going to say that. Was that a pure direct reference to Nancy Drew?
Yes, but it was in the story. I mean, all the story, it's most of the story points were developed by all of us, all the writers, and George. So when you look at any one story, it's not. I can't really say it's completely mine.
Right.
It's a combination of mostly George and then and certainly all of those writers. Selbo, Rosemary Ann Sisson's amazing writer. She passed away not that long ago, but she sort of, she'd written Upstairs, Downstairs. She was like the sort of queen of etiquette over, when she came to America, they didn't put her on an airplane. She came over on the QE2 and gave lectures about her books and things. And she'd arrive and sit there in the corner of the writer's room, like to sort of, oh no, they wouldn't say that to each other. They'd say this, and she'd get that right. And then Hensley, of course, Jonathan Hensley went on to become a really great, sort of action adventure writer, and he wrote things like Armageddon and all of those big movies, and he directs action movies. So he wrote most of the First World War stuff, and Darabont, has this sort of very sort of intellectual approach, and my favorite episode he wrote was with Schweitzer.
I love that episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's great because we had this turning point that we had to sort of embrace in the film. I mean, this is what I'm saying. It's just like there's a sort of communal ownership amongst all the writers of the stories, and then the fact that you were privileged enough to be asked to write something would be because George and Rick thought, well, Frank's going to be the person who's going to do the Schweitzer. He's really smart. Matthew isn't smart enough to write that one, and so we'll give him the one about the little children learning how to talk to each other. So it's kind of like that. What can you say?
I guess it's kind of like what you were saying about who gets ownership over it. But the setup and payoff of this episode, I think it works really well because you sort of establish Dr. Thompson. He's more of an ally than a foe. He's like there at their dinner table, and it really disguises his involvement in stealing the battery plans.
Yes.
Yeah, and however, I think there's some clear foreshadowing in this episode, concerning the electric car and the oil companies, and, along with Dr. Thompson's complaining about Edison getting the credit for his inventions. So I guess, how do you go about knowing how much foreshadowing to use without it being too obvious?
So that's a really good question. And when I say it's a really good question, what I mean is I don't know the answer. Really, I don't think there's a technique. I think when foreshadowing becomes too obvious, like it becomes an exposition dump, as they say. So you'll have, I don't know, Do you guys remember? Do you guys remember a movie called Wayne's World?
You sound like old Indy right there.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
So Wayne's World is like, like he'll stop and the limo driver will get out and say, every day I come here and I do this and I do that and I do that. And then, they look at the camera. Why did he tell me all of that? We'll find out later. So you have to watch out for foreshadowing being like exposition dumps, just getting a pile of information that the audience goes, oh yeah, I'd better remember that because we're going to be using it later. So you don't want it to feel like that. You want to feel like it comes, that it comes naturally from the story. Somebody has to, how you deal with exposition or foreshadowing or anything like that is it has to be done on a kind of need to know basis. Like we really need to know this to get on to the next point in the story. So certainly when you're laying the groundwork for a mystery, you have to almost think backwards from the solution to the mystery, and you have to take stuff out so that the audience keeps asking questions. And you know this when you sit and you watch a TV show with your mother, your brother, or somebody's uncle or aunt, and they keep on asking questions all the way through the show. Why is he doing that?
Oh yeah,
yeah. Why was he? And it gets really irritating. You want to punch them after a while, but as a writer, you realize that those questions are your lifeblood.
Right.
Those questions that the audience is asking the screen, normally in their head. Hopefully in their head, so they don't disturb it for the other people who are watching. Those questions are what keeps them watching. So you have to respect those questions, and in the next scene, you want to answer those questions
right
with questions, with new questions. Do you see what I'm doing? That's how you keep something moving forward. If you just answer the question and then it lies there like boom. It's like an episode ending. Do you know what I mean? And those are like episodic. If you do it intentionally, like in a road movie, it's great. But if you do it unintentionally, then it starts to get a little bit wooden. And so that was always the challenge with Young Indy, where there were certain things that we needed to get across because this was also an educational thing. And so we'd have these things that we'd have to come up with some clever way of landing them, so that it didn't feel leaden or expositional. And that was always a challenge. And sometimes we got it right, and sometimes it was a bit boring. You had to watch out for it.
Well, let's move on to the next episode, which is Vienna 1908, also known as the first half of Perils of Cupid. And I know we touched on this a little bit earlier with the different philosophers and their ideas about love. So I guess, what did you want to establish about Indy and the theme of love in this episode, I guess, from his perspective?
It really just had to be about love. I mean, Vienna in that era was... And I know this was really George's thing, I think when he was starting the show, he had this episode kind of mapped out in his mind already. He knew that it would be, start with Indy looking at Klimt's painting The Kiss, and this is a little boy who he's 10 years old, however old he is, and he's waking up to the idea of love. Now, of course, he's waking up to the idea of love in the town where Freud is being almost put in jail for saying that children can love and be as sexually driven as adults. And then it's still a controversial thing for people to say, but Freud was saying it then. So it was a fascinating episode to do from that point of view. And of course, the first person Indy asks about this is his Miss Seymour, and Miss Seymour sort of gets him into poetry, and so she shows him, sort of here are these beautiful expressions of that, and he gets a crush. He has a crush on Sophie. She's riding a horse. He's riding a horse. There are horses there. I mean, it was a minefield, but it was also a fun. It could have been one of the cheesiest episodes ever, but because it had Billy August directing it, it didn't sort of become too sappy. Bits of it are sappy, but it didn't become too sappy. Do you know what I mean? He still gave it a lovely edge, which I really appreciate. I really appreciated that. I was so relieved, because it's a dangerous, it's difficult to have on American TV a little boy going, "What is love?" And then people go, "Love is," and so the challenge with that was the third act, which I took, the third quarter, the educational part, where we had that wonderful dinner party scene, which I talked about before.
Let's talk a little bit more about the poetry that Miss Seymour was having Indy read. Was it you or maybe George Lucas get inspired to include the poem "Love's Philosophy" in the episode?
I think it was me. I can't be sure. I can't remember. To be honest, I can't. Obviously, Debbie would come with a bunch of poems, and then obviously I think probably it might have been Jonathan Hales who suggested that poem, but at a certain point you get overloaded by research, so I think I popped out and I bought one of those Philosophy for Dummies books, and because I thought, well, what are the bare essentials that really people need to know? Especially when I was doing the philosophy one, but with psychiatry, and it was a similar thing. I almost needed to simplify all the different approaches to the connection between romance, sex, and psychiatry, and all of those things, because this is it was a delicate episode, and I actually think George's basic conceit that Indy is prepared to risk his life for love at a very, very young age is wonderful. It's just great. This was one of my favorite episodes, certainly.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many terrific moments in this episode, right? I mean, first of all, this dynamic between Indy and Sophie, right? I mean, she's part of the Austrian royal family, and even Indy, who to us seems very wealthy, to her is kind of this foreigner, right? And then,
right.
You talked about the dinner scene a little bit, which, I'm curious to know if there's anything else that you sort of had in mind with this, because, each of these historical figures, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Adler, you understand each of their philosophies by the way they attempt to define love. And so, what was your writing process like for, I think, arguably one of the more powerful monologues in this series?
I felt it was great. Basically, at that time, to write a 15-minute scene, or 16-minute scene, I don't know how long it is, to write a 15-minute scene in a network TV show was just forbidden. You don't do it. TV is shorter scenes. Now, with streaming, look, you do get it done a lot, but then it was something that was not done. So for me, it was an opportunity to write a little stage play. It was an opportunity to sort of really bring the characters to the tables. As I talked earlier about, you want to find not only what drives the person, but what they're doing wrong. What their problem is. So bringing all these people and all their problems around a table suddenly became such fun to write. And I think my first draft was probably about 30 or 40 pages long, just of that scene.
Oh, wow.
And then we edited until we ended up with something that was more shootable. So that was the core of that episode. And I think and I think it's nice because it's a dramatic core. It really is like theater, that scene.
Absolutely. It's fantastic. And now let's kind of move into the second part of your time on this series, which is interesting that you kind of shed some light on this earlier with these TV movies, which were originally conceived as, of course, their own 1-hour episodes. After 1993, the show got canceled by ABC, and so George Lucas comes back with these 4 additional movies. And let's start with Hollywood Follies, which is quite an interesting episode because you essentially had to create a film about creating a film, right? I mean, Indy works with director Jack Ford on this fictitious film, ironically enough, called 6 Steps to Hell. And to me, this episode did a really good job depicting how a movie is made without making it feel like a documentary. And the first thing I'm curious to ask is, did you feel like this episode was very ambitious to put together?
I think it was. I was so happy to get that episode to write. I can't even tell you. It was like one of my. It was. I think it was one of the ones I said I have to write this, the Jack Ford one, because there's so much to learn from that filmmaker, and also the contrast between Ford and von Stroheim. The idea of putting those 2 stories next to each other. I think it's one of the more efficient, combination movies that were done, because the story really lends itself, and it's to a feature structure, in as much as he has this romance, he falls in love with this person who's this up and coming screenwriter in the first episode, and George actually wrote the middle scene. There's a middle scene. That is where he has an argument to stay with her in Santa Monica or wherever she is, and they have this argument about you can see it because there's even a line like she says, "I'm not some piece of merchandising." Only George would write that, I think. So it was like, and I'm sitting there going, yeah, I wouldn't write this scene, but he definitely would write this scene. And so they have that argument there, and then she's hanging out with Tony, and he's going to have to go on location and shoot with Jack Ford, and of course the whole thing about a film about filmmaking is, and I'm pretty much a kind of gestalt kind of filmmaker. I know how to do most of the jobs on making a film. Maybe I don't know how to operate a camera. I mean, I could give it a go, but I've certainly directed, written, acted, done most of the jobs. So and at that point, I think when we were writing that, I'd been hired to do Lassie for Lorne Michaels, and I was I was on the Paramount lot, which is where Lorne Michaels' company was based, and I had that experience of being kind of almost under the Hollywood sign in a bungalow at night with the joy of writing a movie. And so that was what I tried to sort of bring to the table, if you like, was this sheer joy that Indy witnesses working with Harry Carey and John Ford, Jack Ford, as they try and fix this awful script, that they 6 Steps to Hell by Al Phoney stutters, and so there's a lot of comedy involved. I mean, here's the thing: is Foolish Wives survives, obviously, because it was this massive film, but at the same time, Jack Ford was churning out these 2-reelers, which he was sometimes doing as 5-reelers, and most of them have been lost. They just don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So in true Indiana Jones tradition, if they've been lost, why couldn't there be one where they did that stunt for the first time? Which, of course, later on, George lifted that stunt from Stagecoach. I asked, can I go down, because they were filming just outside of LA, and it was around the time, I think, of the Northridge earthquake. There was a big earthquake, and we'd just moved over there, and I wanted to take my children, my 2 sons, to see it being filmed, just a couple of days of it. And we went to see there were two sequences. There's a sequence where Indy basically does the stagecoach stunt, and another sequence later on where they're deciding whether or not to do the stunt. Another sequence where he's having lunch after he's been humiliated as an actor, and then finally the little campfire scene where the actors make fun of him, and tell him how to deal with the romance that's going on in his life, and in a very John Ford kind of way. And so they were very sweet scenes, and the boys were little, and it was just such a nice atmosphere. I've got these lovely photos of the boys with Sean and with the cowboys who all came in, and they really liked them. And my older son would do this thing of throwing stones, because he was at that age. I think he was 7 or 8, just throwing stones. And Sean liked that, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to do that the next scene." So you see this scene where he's throwing a stone, which helps establish how steep the hill is for the stunt. Whoa. So my oldest son was so proud, because he'd got this, he had inadvertently given Sean this sort of acting idea. And then later on, at the end of the day, Sean really did do a lot of his own stunts.
Yeah.
In that sequence, that sort of stagecoach sequence, he's meant to ride up alongside an out-of-control stagecoach. Not stagecoach, carriage or whatever it is. It's being pulled by a set of 4 horses. And he's meant to jump from his horse onto one of the horses that's on the runaway carriage. Now, in any sane world, you wouldn't let your lead actor do that stunt.
Right.
but these were relatively low budget, and he was into it, and he did it himself. And so as a result, Michael Schultz was sort of saying, anybody who's got a camera or anybody who's got a video camera, we don't care. We want you to film this, because we want this from as many angles as possible. This might be the last time that we see Sean. So the boys were very proudly working my little video camera, taking shots of the stunt from a distance. Obviously, totally unusable. I think I can't remember. But that's my memory of having the most fun on a Young Indy set. I didn't get to see a lot of them. Most, I think you've been talking to the directors. The show went on for quite a time, where it became people's lives.
Right.
So it was a big thing. But yeah, no, that's my memory. My bit of that show starts when they sit down with John Ford when the Mickey Finney has failed, and that was where my episode started, and then from there on, it's like go for one, studio executive one day, go for the next, So there again, a lot of the John Ford stuff is there. There's equally a sort of lovely commentary in that film, the difference between the sort of auteur artistic kind of filmmaker like von Stroheim, who is totally so much smarter than anybody around there. Do you know what I mean? Completely outsmarts Indy, and Indy can't get him under control. There's no way, and he gets fired. And you'll notice that the person, after they go to the stage to shut him down, and they find, oh my God, von Stroheim's gone. There's only one person there who's sweeping the stage, and he's called George.
That's hilarious. Well, one of the interesting things about this episode, too, that I like is, I think you all had the chance, and especially you being a writer, to kind of, put a little bit of yourself and also, your role as a screenwriter into the film. Like Claire as a character, I'm sure was very relatable for you as well. And, some of these other characters and Jack Ford coming back, Harry Carey, they get this script, which is horrible. It was assigned to them. And so they create their own. So it accurately displays it in that way, I think.
Yeah, she talks about how exciting it is to write and make films. She tries to educate Indy as to why it's such a wonderful world.
Yeah, absolutely. Another interesting aspect of this episode too is the inclusion of Wyatt Earp and this more very traditional sort of Western tropes and all of those elements. What exactly were you trying to do with that aspect of the episode as well?
It's kind of interesting. It's come into play recently. Is that my dad was in a Doctor Who episode called The Gunfighters, where he played Doc Holliday, and Doctor Who ends up in, and that was in 1966. He'd done that, and of course I was kind of fascinated by the fact that Universal Studios are really quite close to where the old cowboys used to hang out. And in fact, it's true that Wyatt Earp was around, and Wyatt Earp did give advice, on movies. And so that, and also it meant that I could have so much fun writing a scene, a barroom scene, where Indiana Jones, who do you want to see you?
Yeah.
Here for Wyatt Earp. Who shall I say is here? Indiana Jones. Okay. And you don't often get the chance to write really good fun like that. And then you have the gunfire scene where, he's saying, if you really want to, kill somebody, you need a rifle. If you use a handgun, it's only good for the critters. You can't.
I love that scene.
And then you shoot them from behind. Well, we can't do that. He's got to be a hero. And then we come up with well, maybe he could be a good bad guy. A good bad guy. What's a good bad guy? And of course, the foundation for that is the whole foundation of the anti-hero. And so it's talking a lot about the nature of the way in which storytelling was. And you've got to imagine as well, before the advent of TV and even cinema, so before cinema, America was an amazingly literary country. People forget this. They'd sign up. People would get their novels. They'd read them, and most of the novels were westerns. Were adventures. There are thousands of these great novels that were out there. It was a tradition, and people they read a lot more in the 1860s, 1870s, things like that. If you look at the amount of copies of Tom Sawyer that Mark Twain sold, and they were being read everywhere. They'd come by mail. People were reading lots.
In chronological order, this was the last episode in the series, and I'm sure you had that in mind when you were creating the episode. And it's also very classic, having Indy ride off into the sunset. But since there were other episodes that were planned, did you feel like this was the best ending for the series?
When I wrote that, I didn't intend it at all to be the end of this series. The riding off into the sunset thing is just, that's what he shot. And the idea was that Jack Ford will shoot the end first. He couldn't get von Stroheim to shoot the end of his movie.
Of course not.
Of course not. So, the completely different approach, where in a Truffaut-like way, John Ford, for him, the art of directing is the art of coping with contingencies. Do you see what I'm saying? So
right.
So whereas von Stroheim, it's like the auteur. My vision has to be, they have to wear silk underwear so they can feel like they're noble, and they all have to speak French. Doesn't matter that it's a silent movie. Both approaches are completely valid. And I think that's what the episode was about. We didn't know it was going to be I didn't know it was going to be the end of the show. I thought the show was going to go on and on and on. I'd written other shows. I'd written a lovely show called Stockholm.
Wow.
1909 was about a very popular book called The Wonderful Adventures of Niels, where Niels gets shrunk a little boy and goes off on the back of a bird and flies, a children's book, and it won one of the Nobel. Was it the Nobel Peace Prize? Or it won some big award, and he's there for that. And then he has a dream. Indy has a dream, and we see him go on a fantastic animated adventure. There were other episodes that were wonderful, like Indy hanging out with Paul Robeson as a 6-year-old or something like that, and then there were episodes that were written. And we couldn't make them, but because the show kind of didn't really, it just ended up being used in a different way, which is a kind of a precursor to the way in which stuff is done now. If you make something for the screen, it can be used in many different ways.
Next, you wrote Attack of the Hawkmen, which is, a phenomenal aviation film about Indy's involvement in the Lafayette Escadrille. And this episode in particular features some remarkable supporting characters. I love how Nungesser's farce and flamboyance, it really nicely contrasts Richthofen's more menacing demeanor. Are there specific characteristics you think are essential for great villains in a film?
Most important thing when you're writing a villain is a villain doesn't regard himself as a villain. A villain has to view himself as his own hero. Otherwise, you have a mustache-twirling idiot. And that's fine if you're writing Dick Dastardly and fantastic races and it's a cartoon. Go for it. Why not? Really, the thing about those guys, the Red Baron and and all of these guys, they thought they were heroes. They thought it was chivalric. Do you know what I mean? It was like they rode around on horses, and there were knights. There were knights on their wall. They saw themselves as these glorious heroes, and in some ways, the most important thing there was Indy has come from having been with Schweitzer and learning that anything that promotes life is good, anything that destroys life is bad. And he's learned that simple thing, and he's thought to himself, well, screw this. If I'm a soldier, I'm going around killing people, that's bad. So I need to stop this war. It's very simplistic. And so the only way I can stop this war is by becoming a spy. And his first job as being a spy is to go to war up against the Red Baron, and so it's sort of bad luck. It's not as pure a spying thing as when he comes to deal with Fokker in the second part of that show. I think it is my memory of that show is a little mixed up, but I do remember my part of it, which was him joining the Lafayette Escadrille and seeing the courage of these people as one by one they get killed, and he's having to photograph this, and then he gets embroiled in a major dogfight, and of course very difficult stuff to film. Ben Burtt did a fantastic job in Marin of pulling off those dogfights, and of course it's the thing that George adores is the old dogfights, the old films of those old dogfights, and it's there in Star Wars. It's a thing, and he'd take us into the office and say, "Here, I've got this film," and he's cut it together. And he was just, we would try out stuff on the ranch. We'd try out stunts or things like that so that we could help the director and say, here's the storyboard, we're going to take this shot from this movie here, this will be taken from some Paramount movie that didn't make much money, and that has a train crashing into a village. We can't afford to shoot that, we'll just use that shot, and now we need all the other shots connected with it. And we'd run around with cameras on fire engines at the ranch and horses, building up a storyboard, sometimes before the director was even hired.
Wow.
To sort of make sure that this was doable, because the budgets weren't very big. So the innovation that went on in terms of special effects, I mean, that's where it got a lot of awards, was because very early forms of CGI in terms of crowd replication and things like that were done on these Young Indy shows, and the certainly the Attack of the Hawkmen episode had a lot of very good special effects, and I was very impressed by how they brought it together.
Yeah, I feel like you guys really succeeded in creating that grand sense of scale with like the effects and the stunts and, you know, the CG we're talking about, you know, with more people in the shots. And I think, you know, the tension and suspense for a lot of these action sequences is really superb. Obviously, the odds of Indy's survival is talked about a lot at the start of the episode. You know, no photographer has lasted more than a week. And we as the audience know Indy's going to survive because we've seen the movies. So how do you still write a compelling story when the outcome is, I guess, already predetermined for the audience?
I think that's the problem with the show in general. It's a problem with prequels.
Right.
So you know, if it means the stakes have to become different. So yes, his life is at stake, but we know he's going to survive. So hopefully you make it so that what's at stake is an emotional thing, and I think in that episode, it was that he realizes he has to risk his life in many ways to honor the people who are losing their lives, and so he learns a different form of courage, whereas when he's a sort of gung-ho soldier fighting in Africa or whatever, it's, come on, charge! We'll kill as many of these people as we possibly can. Yeah, boom, kill, things like that. Something like this. Whereas, when he becomes a spy, it's not, I want to kill people, and he realizes, so the bravery is different. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's really an evolution of his character through the series.
Yes. So that's what the stakes become. The stakes become, does he manage to make the next step in his development as a character? So that's how we ended up really having to deal with the fact that it's a prequel. And I think the same applies, obviously. I know that the Star Wars prequels were not very popular, but I actually kind of like them. I really do, because I think the Star Wars prequels that he did are a good follow-on from Young Indiana Jones. There's a lot of the same people who worked on Young Indy,
right?
Worked on Phantom Menace and the others. Rick McCallum, a lot of the technical teams, and John Hales ended up writing, I think, episode 2, so they, a lot of the same things like that, and as a result, when you look at those prequels, they feel a little bit as though they're set in the early 20th century. There's a lot about imperialism, there's a lot of politics going on,
right?
Which is not the stuff of the space western that was in episode 4.
Right. Now, another thing that's interesting about this episode, and one thing that I have often liked in films, is the concept of diegetic music. And there's 2 great scenes when everybody's singing these military tunes. Gary Owen and the young aviator lay dying. Was that your idea to specifically include this music in the episode?
Yes. That really was my idea. I was doing research. When I say my idea, Debbie Fine had done the research, right? But then I also sort of read another book, and I came across that song, I think when I was doing the first draft, and I went, good grief, that's such a great song. And everybody agreed. Here's the thing, when you do a montage is where you're making a story point, but the story isn't really moving forward. It's a love montage, Okay, your characters have fallen in love, so the kind of story stops because now they're having a nice time. So we're going to see them licking ice cream. You know what I mean? And there's going to be a song. So this was this was a kind of a song montage. So it was kind of, but it wasn't obviously a love montage. But it was a very important montage, because the thing about music is you use music for a montage because you want to get to the core of some emotion, be it the expression of love, the expression of fear, the expression of just sheer, we're on a path here that where the days are being knocked off, and will Indy survive? So that's why I was looking for a song, because I needed to give that story beat some real life.
Now, one great moment to end, Attack of the Hawkmen is, this iconic one-liner that is in this movie, full throttle, no brakes, right? Which is what, Charles Nungesser says when Indy is, frightened to go into the sky, and then Indy cleverly uses it at the end. And so with this specific one-liner, and also just in general, what do you think makes a one-liner so memorable?
Oh my gosh. I think it's the same thing that makes a title or a tagline memorable. It has to do two things. It has to sum up the action of what you're talking about, but it also has to sum up the theme, the argument that the show or TV is about. I'm going to commit to something. Do you see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
If you think of any great title, it works on two levels.
Well, let's move on to the final episode you wrote, which was Travels with Father. This episode is such a masterpiece because it creates a strong, sentimental story between Indy and his father, and it also provides so much depth, I think, for Last Crusade. Was this episode one of the more compelling ones to write, and how did that dynamic, the mannerisms of Sean Connery in Last Crusade, how did that influence your writing for Indy's father in this episode?
Obviously, I adored the Last Crusade and the relationship and the fact that was there. And I think everybody has complex relations with their parents. So it wasn't hard to bring oneself to the table. My part of Travels with My Father is the Greek part. I wrote and it was a separate 1 hour about the nature of philosophy. And so I wrote that. Frank Darabont wrote the Tolstoy part. That was a separate episode about Tolstoy. Do you see what I'm saying? And then they only ended up coming together later on. But when we were doing the and I can't remember whether it was at the first story session or the rewrite session. The most complex part of Travels with My Father, which is after they've been up in the hanging monastery and he's met Kazantzakis, and Kazantzakis has explained to him, Aristotelian causality, the theories of causality. And we then get to the fourth act. And you remember I told you how, like, in the fourth act, you have your Indiana Jones thing. So the third act is the learning act, i.e. him sitting down with Kazantzakis, and Kazantzakis coming up with that beautiful poetic, which is all entirely from my head, actually. Because
Wow.
he never did any of that stuff. I mean, he was interested in philosophy, and he did study it, but there's nothing that particular explanation of causality was something that I'd put together. And we after that, then it has to be an Indiana Jones story. So the only thing that I could come up with was, they get stuck in that elevator in the lift, coming down from the monastery, and Dad screws things up by trying to start a fire, and of course burning the cage, and they're suspended over there, and the way I write action, and the way that we were all, certainly I think the way George sort of does this. What is the worst thing that could happen next to your character? How can things really go wrong? Whatever that happens, whatever that is, that's the thing you should do. You shouldn't do some action thinking, oh, I know how he's going to get out of this. Well, we got to that situation, and then it was like, well, how do we apply the philosophy to this? And it was Frank Darabont and said, Well, maybe Indiana Jones's philosophy of life is turn your cage into a ladder.
Yeah.
And that's very much, and we all loved that. So it's like Frank Darabont, who doesn't get a credit. Well, we do end up sharing kind of credit, I suppose, in a way, and I would contribute stuff to the Tolstoy thing, But when you're writing in a group of people, it's like if somebody's got a good idea that can be used, you use it. So, and apart from that, it was essentially a comedic idea, in as much as his dad, the last thing he wants to do is look after this stupid boy. He really hates the idea of doing it. So you have the perfect road movie setup where two people who don't really want to be together have to be together, and they just goes from bad to worse. So it was writing a comedy. They get their clothes stolen from them. Dad is doing his best to sort of demonstrate philosophical ideas and theatre and all those things. Obviously, I brought a lot of stuff that my dad. I remember when we were doing the stories, I would tell stories. When we were doing the story, I would tell. I think that's why I got the episode, really, because my dad was bipolar, and as a kid, we'd go on these incredible adventures with him, not knowing that he was bipolar. Do you see what I'm saying? Because we were just little kids. So suddenly we'd be off on these adventures. He'd say, I'm going to set up Robin Hood radio broadcasting, and we're going to rebroadcast BBC radio from this hill in the middle of the night to this town. And we were just kids, and we'd be, helping him with a little medium wave transmitter. And I'd tell stories like that in the writing room as we were meeting, and bit by bit, we started to realize that I should write that episode, because it is a comedic premise, and then the father is trying his best to be a good dad and teach his son what he cares about, which is philosophy, and he's trying to do that, but the comedy is constantly getting in the way. And then when he gets really irritated with Indy and says, okay, I want you to go off and explain the 4 principles of causality or whatever it is, and you really get the existential philosophy that informed sort of Aristotelian thought. And it's a very deep little bit that he does, that Kazantzakis does when he talks about, what makes the orange fall from the tree, the desire to make more oranges. What does why does this happen? And he's trying to demonstrate it to a child, and Kazantzakis can do this. Indy's dad can't really do it because his dad is lost in academia, has long since forgotten how to really talk to children or how to communicate on that level. Maybe he can talk, but then when their lives are put in danger at the end of the episode, they do have to find a common ground. Indy sees that his dad really cares for him, and I think that's the magic of that episode, is them reaching a. And in some ways, yes, it's it's total precursor for the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, because a similar kind of thing happens there. So we were definitely doing that, and I think the bookends that Jonathan Hales wrote for the feature version, are with Sean coming back and actually confronting his father for the first time about what he wants to do with his life. And I think that was a great way of bookending those two stories.
Right, because it sort of resets it, and then Last Crusade is able to take over and bring things back into where they should be. But there's this terrific comic relief scene with Aristotle and Plato, the carriage driver and the donkey, not the philosophers. And it stirs up a whole political discussion, and it creates, I guess, to reference some of the other episodes, some incandescent rage for Henry Jones Sr. What was the purpose behind inventing this scene?
I think it was a joke that George had. I think it was George's idea to do a scene like that. I mean, I think it was in his head, and the part that I enjoyed about that scene is the idea that only an idiot is not interested in politics, and I thought this is a building block for Indy. Because Indy gets involved in politics quite a lot. He gets involved in women's suffrage. He gets involved in the Russian Revolution. He is Tintin.
Exactly.
You name it, he's there. And so I felt, as a young boy, you are kind of in awe of your father. And so the father can really mess with that in some ways. Your father is your hero, and is there in this incredibly silly situation, and where you see that philosophers don't always agree with each other, and I think that's really also what that film's about. What that scene's about. It was not an easy episode to write because it's not like a war or Schweitzer keeping people alive or something like that. We're dealing with an academic thing, so therefore the show had to be sort of comedic, I think. And I think Deepa Mehta, who's an Indian director, she came out to Marin when I was writing when she was starting that, and she had a very she was I think in some ways the most spiritual approach to any of the episodes. She was really I had a dinner with her and we really talked about those scenes, and she was a really good director. She really was, and it's quite interesting because her direction is very different to whoever directed the Tolstoy one. So as a feature film, I don't think I've ever watched it through, because they're very different. I'm not sure they should. At the risk of saying it, I wouldn't put them together. Also, Darabant's writing is a little is different. It's not driven in the same way as the Greek one is.
Right. And that's interesting that you talk about the writing process of philosophy, and, especially, to us as viewers, most of us, have watched the DVD version. So it's very, very interesting to hear you talk how different these episodes are when they're not paired together. But I think what's so successful about this episode is, the concept of philosophy and the metaphor with the phrase ergo that, comes up all throughout. And, as a final question for Travels with Father, why did you think, outside of the historical reasons and, the location, of course, why was philosophy so important to sort of represent this profound relationship?
Well, if you're traveling around the world, then you go to Greece. Greece is the home of philosophy, so it became a very obvious place to go. And also, again, it's something that's not really taught in schools, and that was, George's objective was really to be able to make a bunch of documentaries from that show that would go into the different philosophical ideas. I think I mentioned this earlier. Maybe it shows Indy actually seeing why his dad is so great in some ways, because his dad it made seem to be incredibly stuffy, this stuff. But when he scratches the surface and gets to talk to Kazantzakis and gets in an adventure or something like that, he realizes this is a philosophy he can take with him for the rest of his life. And the ergo thing, is a case of, how do we use our thought process to understand the world around us, to understand existence? That's what marks us out as humans, I suppose. yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the average squirrel regards itself as a philosophical being, and is probably having the exact same conversation in squirrel language that we're having right now. But as far as I know, they're not. So you have to say, this is the great thing about human beings, is they love to see patterns and stuff. They love to think that they know what's going on.
Whereas, they do, don't they?
Yeah. Whereas, really, at the end of the day, we don't. And it's so you have to balance that nihilistic approach of, we don't really know what's going on. We are destroying our planet. It won't be very long before we're all gone. And there's that nihilism. With isn't it glorious that we can even think that and know that and still make these mistakes and still at the same time make, beautiful shows on TV and make beautiful paintings and build wonderful buildings, compose fantastic music. All these things that we can do as humans. So beautiful.
The last question here, as you reminisce about the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, now 30 years later, what did you take away from the experience, and what impact has the show had on you as a filmmaker and as a person?
Well, it stood me in really good stead in terms of coming to America and making American American films. Up until that point, I hadn't really worked on American projects. And obviously working with Lucas gave me a wonderful intro into the industry here. And I think it affected my life in a big way because we moved out to Marin, which is where my wife wanted to live. It's a big part of my life, and obviously it enabled me to work for other people and carry on working for George. I mean, I did stuff like, I did some couple of video games for him, Star Wars Starfighter. Yeah. And for a little while I was quite good friends with George, but as I moved on to do other stuff, and he obviously moved on to do other stuff, we've lost touch. But at that time, he was concerned that the dialogue on the cut scenes that you get at the various levels of the games wasn't very good. He didn't like it. He wanted somebody there who was going to write the dialogue that he liked, that was right for the characters, and things like that. So basically, I got hired to write dialogue. I wasn't really designing the game. Darren Stinnett and his team were designing those two games, but I was just brought in to create the characters, help create the characters, and write dialogue. So I carried on working with him for a bit, and then I was worked for a bit with Francis Coppola's company, Zoetrope. I sold a science fiction idea. It kick-started my American career, basically.
Well, Mr. Jacobs, it has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to have you join the Indiana Jones Universe podcast today. Thanks so much for sharing all these behind-the-scenes stories, and I hope you enjoyed this interview.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I had no idea it would be this much fun. This is a joyous thing. I just hope you're able to edit something out of it so that it'll be a joy for people to listen to.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's going to turn out very well. And with that said, that about concludes today's episode, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. And if this was your first time joining the show, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, tell other people what you think about the show. You can also visit our website at www.theindianajonesuniverse.com and join our conversation over on Twitter. You can find us there at The Indie Universe. But thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Once again, I'm Elijah.
And I'm Will.
And I'm Matthew Jacobs. And until next time, so long, Dr. Jones.